Welcome back to the Business Exit and Acquisition Playbook. I'm Trent Lee, top business broker in the country, and today we're diving into one of the most overlooked deal killers, the lease or the lease assignment. Here's the truth. You can have the perfect buyer, the perfect seller, financing is all in line, but if the landlord says no or their lease terms are terrible, the deal dies. Period. Bottom line, they control everything. They have an important role here, and sometimes they know it, and sometimes they don't, but they can be a challenge to work with. This is in particularly important because I literally am just getting off of a deal nearly dying because we had the perfect buyer, the perfect seller, bank approval, and the landlord was the most unreasonable, difficult landlord I've ever dealt with. It took us months, but we finally got through it and the deal closed just last week. So I'm going to walk you through some things to look out for, some questions to ask the landlord before they approve you, what the SBA requirements are and how to prepare it, and how to avoid some hidden traps that could cost you a lot of money or derail the deal altogether. So, why do so many great businesses fail at the landlord stage? It's because buyers and sellers ignore it until it's too late. They think, oh, the lease, that's easy, that's just paperwork. Not quite. It's literally the oxygen that keeps the business alive if you are in a physical location. Without that, the business is dead or significantly derailed if you have to move, and who knows how that then affects the day-to-day operations, the financials, if you have to go and find a whole new location. So if the landlord won't approve you, no SBA lender will fund it. So you can't close. Or worse, if you do close and you're not using the SBA, but you're stuck with a bad, toxic term lease, skyrocketing rent, hidden fees, lease that expires in 2 years with no options to renew, you've bought a business and you've got an uncertain future in the next couple of years. So let's start with the most basic question. How much time is left on the lease? One of the first things you should be looking at. Banks want a lease that will last at least as long as their loan. Most SBA loans are 10 years, so no lease term, no funding. That's period. That's the bottom line. So the lease term needs to be open to 10 years. Now, that's not to say that you need a lease for 10 years. That's to say that you need a runway of 10 years. So that could be I'm just making this up, a 5-year lease with one 5-year option to renew. That gets you to a total of 10 years. That could be a 1-year lease with 9 options to renew for 1 year. That gets you to a total of 10 years. Doesn't matter how you get there, as long as you have a total runway of 10 years. The only way around that is to make a case to the lender that the location of the business is totally irrelevant to the operations of the business. In that case, then the bank will do a waiver and not require a 10-year lease. They will simply just want to make sure that you have a lease assignment, that you can take over legal possession of that, but you can always change the location. That's relevant. In fact, a deal I'm doing right now, which is a home healthcare business, the lease is really not relevant. No employees come there, no customers come there. It's for the most part just an office for their admin. No one would even know if they moved. In that case, we don't need a 10-year runway, but we do need a approved lease assignment, but it doesn't have to be as strict as some of the other businesses where the lease is relevant to the business and it is vital to the business. And so let's make sure that if you have a good feel for how long the lease is and how many options there are to extend. If the lease has strict rules, then another thing you need to look for is you can be trapped here. Some landlords demand rent increases or reapproval every time you sell, and that could kill the valuation. So here's another wrinkle most buyers don't know about. With assignments, the seller usually remains as a backup guarantor. You, the buyer, become the primary, but if you default, the landlord can still chase the seller. Landlords love this because it's an extra safety for them. Sellers, not so much. So it's important that if you're dealing with a seller, that they know that this is the case. If they're working with a good business broker, this should not be news to them. But I can't tell you how many times we've had a buyer try to buy a business, get a lease assignment approval, meaning we've got everything. We're done with due diligence. We're done with financing. We got lease assignment approval. We're now ready to start scheduling closing. And then the seller is hearing for the first time that they are a backup guarantor should the buyer fail. And they are all of a sudden are like, I'm not comfortable with that. It derails the whole deal. So this should not be news to them. You want to make sure that they understand that. Speaking of guarantees, what about the personal guarantee that the landlord makes you sign? Almost every lease will ask for a personal guarantee. Don't panic. Not only is this normal, but the reality is you're already signing one for the SBA. So it's pretty normal. Some landlords will offer creative trade-offs. If you don't want to have a personal guarantee for the full term of the lease, most will have you sign a personal guarantee for the entire time that you're a tenant. But there are some landlords that will get a little bit creative. Here's what we've done in the past. We've done a burn-off period where after 3 years of on-time payments, it drops to a limited guarantee. We've also increased the security deposit. So if you put a larger security deposit, sometimes 6 to 12 months of prepaid rent or security deposit, they can drop that personal guarantee or do a limited guarantee. Think of it as leverage, less risk for the landlord and more freedom for you. Maybe something you talk about with the property manager, the landlord, maybe not. That depends on how comfortable you are with the personal guarantee and the period of time. But like I said, if you're doing an SBA loan, it doesn't really matter because you're signing a personal guarantee for the full 10 years of the SBA loan. But now that we're on the SBA, let's talk about another layer to this. Let's talk about the SBA rules. SBA lenders won't close unless there's a lease that lines up with their loan term. Like we talked about, it must cover the full 10 years. There's also what's called a landlord waiver or subordination. The landlord must agree that the bank comes first. If they default, the bank can step in, sell the assets, and assign the lease to another buyer. Some landlords resist this, so be ready for some pushback. It's not uncommon for the landlord and the bank to modify that waiver. Sometimes, if you get with a really easy to work with landlord, they'll just sign the waiver, no problem. I've never had this derail a deal. As long as the bank can be flexible and the landlord can be flexible on what edits need to be made on that form. But it is a potential hurdle, so just be aware of it. Also, depending on the state and the lender and some of the circumstances, there's an estoppel certificate. The landlord confirms in writing that the lease is in good standing. There's no hidden disputes, there are no side deals that the bank doesn't know about. If you know these 3 points up front, you could save weeks of stress and avoid any last-minute surprises. All right, now let's look at the money side. Rent increases and CAM charges. Rarely does a rent or a tenant stay flat. You'll typically see 3, 4% annual step up or CPI based bumps. Model that out. What looks profitable today might be tight in 5 years if you don't plan for that rent increase. So just make sure you work through those and have a good business plan to make sure that there's business growth to keep up with the rent increase that's going to almost always be part of every deal. Now, there's CAM charges. If you're a first-time buyer, you might not necessarily know what this is. Common area maintenance. Think parking lot lights, landscaping, property taxes. These can jump up fast, and you always need to look for a breakdown and a cap on the increases if possible. Depending on the lease, those can be either a set amount or it can be tied to the amount of the square footage that you're using in the entire complex. So if you're just taking up 1,000 square feet and the whole complex is 30,000, your responsibility is going to be prorated based on how much you're using of the whole space. If you've got a huge area, it's going to increase. But typically, that's how it's going to look. Now, here's another trap: use restrictions. Some leases limit what you can do or sell. No alcohol, no second location within 5 miles, no live music. Always check the lease for the business plan and your future growth, as well as the franchise rules. I've seen juice bars unable to sell smoothies because a coffee shop next door has an exclusivity offer. So it's important to make sure that you have someone professional helping you review the lease and those terms. So, how do you actually win landlord approval? That starts with a really good package. Just like we started this entire video series with, is putting together a really good buyer package for you as a buyer to look credible and to look like you've got it all together. Same thing goes with property managers and landlords. We want to put together a good package. Think of it like a job applications. Landlords want to know, can you pay rent for the next 10 years? Will you protect their property? What are you going to do? Are you going to change the name, the concept, the menu, the services, what's being sold? So landlord packet is really important. You want tax returns. Be prepared to provide personal tax returns, resume, SBA pre-approval letter, personal financial statements, bank statements, accounts that show any type of liquidity. Look polished and you'll outshine 90% of the applications. So good with a good business broker to help you put together a landlord package. But here's the key. You only get one chance to make your first impression. So I've seen people where they are like, oh, you know what? I don't really want to show too much to the landlord. It's not really their business. I don't want them to see all my accounts. I don't want them to see my investment, my retirement account, my savings, my home equity. The reality is the landlord needs to see all that. They want to see that you've got liquidity. They don't want to see that you're using every single last dime you have to buy this business and have no working capital, no post-closing liquidity, no savings available to you. That's going to look like a high-risk tenant to them. You want to look as strong as possible. The best way to look as strong as possible is to show as much liquid assets as possible, which is why some of these online gurus that talk about buying a business for zero money down, one, it's highly unlikely. Let me put it that way. It's a whole separate, we could have a whole separate podcast on how unlikely it is. But here's the thing, I've seen it happen. I've been part of it more than once. But the people who are buying a business for no money down are not buying a business for no money down because they have no money. They're buying a business for no money down because they're getting a really good deal and they've got plenty of capital and credibility behind them to operate that business. Think about it from this standpoint, from a landlord situation. If you try and buy a business with no money down because you have no money, even if you got the seller to agree, the landlord's going to decline it because you're too high of a risk for them. So let's talk then about meeting either the landlord or the property manager. So, this is not a Shark Tank episode. The landlords don't want to hear about how much money you're going to make in the future, about your great ideas and all that kind of stuff. They just want to know, are you going to pay the rent on time and are you going to keep the property in good condition and be a stable tenant? That's all they really care about. So, show confidence, respect, knowledge of the business. That's enough to win them over with a good business landlord package that you put together. If you get to the point where you can meet the property manager or the landlord, that's the goal, is can you pay the rent on time? Are you going to take good care of the property? You're going to make any improvements to it? And are you going to be a long-term stable tenant? And you do that by showing liquid assets. So after all that, the last piece before closing is the estoppel certificate, depending on the state and the land and the bank, if that is something. Basically, all that really does is it just confirms that the lease is real, it's accurate. The SBA wants this, and sometimes, like I said, not all lenders require it, but sometimes they require it before funding. It's like a landlord's basic sworn statement saying there's no hidden rent hikes, there's no disputes that are ongoing that could disrupt you continuing to operate the business as it has historically been operating. So finally, do you take over the seller's lease or negotiate a new one? Assignments are faster and you inherit the old terms. New leases can be better or worse depending on where the economy is and where things are at in the shopping center. But for the most part, as a general rule, new leases are never better for the buyer. They almost always go up. The landlord almost always wants more rent at a higher price. So assignments are not only faster, but you lock in the same rate and terms that the seller had. So if their business worked on the terms that they have on their current lease, the chances are those same lease terms are going to be good for you as a buyer. rather than trying to get a new lease where all of a sudden your rent goes up significantly. This is often the case is property managers underestimate the CAMs, and then you get hit if you're doing a new lease trying to make up for that. And so I typically would recommend an assignment for the fastest and easiest approach here. But I've seen it go both ways. There's no right or wrong answer. As normal, the memorable model here, the acronym that I always like to leave you guys with is LEASE. LEASE is the acronym. L stands for the length and the terms to look for. E in lease is the estoppel and the SBA waiver that's going to be required. A in the lease is the assignment rules. Seller as a backup, all the terms that you're going to be taking over go for an assignment. S on the lease framework is step up or CAM charges. You want to look for any type of step up in fees, step up in rent, or CAM charges, just so you're aware of it. It's typically in every single lease, but you want to budget for it. And finally, E in our lease framework is an experienced packet for the landlord. You want to look like an experienced buyer that's got the liquidity and you're in a good position to take this over. So if you run through this, you'll cover 90% of the traps. Whether you do or don't do it alone, part of your legal due diligence will be to have an attorney review the lease so you understand what you're agreeing to. I've seen some strange things in leases. Let me give you just two examples. One, you pay a percentage of your business sales above a baseline to the property manager. This means you have to hand over the monthly statements to your property manager, who will be analyzing your business every single month. But you also don't know exactly what your rent's going to be because you've got a baseline where you know at a minimum what your rent is, but the better the business does, the more you have to pay the property manager. You want to make sure that you're aware of this. Sometimes that makes sense, and that's just the way things happen in major shopping centers, complex areas, malls, that type of stuff. That's typically how it happens. You want to be aware of it and budget for some fluctuation there. I've also seen this one literally kill the deal and there was no recovery, but I've seen where the lease stated that if the business is sold, the landlord is entitled to 50% of the sale proceeds of the business, even though they have no ownership in the business. Because it was a tenant, they wanted 50%. In theory, the landlord literally killed the seller's business, the valuation, because they were entitled to 50% of the proceeds. So let an attorney review the lease and give you counsel here. So just as a recap, leases can kill deals that look okay on the books, but have a bad term or a hard landlord to deal with. SBA lenders need a 10-year lease runway, landlord waiver, and possibly an estoppel. Assignments often keep the seller as a backup guarantor, so just make sure that they're aware of this. And don't fear the personal guarantees. You've already signed one for the SBA, but if it is an issue, look for some type of a burn off period or excess or extra deposits that can soften them and reduce that personal guarantee. And last but not least, prepare a really good landlord packet. Nail that meeting, and remember, you only get one first time to make your first impression. So follow the lease framework and you'll be just fine. Thanks, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.